Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we'll just make note that we have all of our board directors present tonight. I don't have any forms for public comment, but would anybody like to make public comment at this time about items that are on the agenda for tonight's meeting? Okay, we're going to move directly into our presentation and discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. We'd like to have the opportunity to speak to the board here this evening regarding our district operating surplus that we've had this year. We've had an opportunity to meet with Mr. Nestor, and I know he has spoke to you via email regarding some of the options that are before you tonight. Some of them deal with what we can do with the anticipated revenues and how we can better support ourselves. So at this time, I would like to have Mr. Nestor really just do a brief summary for the public to talk about the surplus a little bit, the different options, and then we'll turn it back to the board then for some discussion regarding those options. Mr. Nestor.
Thank you, Dr. Shirk. The Pottsgrove School District ended this fiscal year with a surplus of approximately $1,173,000. That was driven by a number of things, some revenue enhancements, as well as some savings in area of certain expenditure areas. Just for a framework, the $1 million figure that I just referenced is approximately 1.8% of our overall budget. Okay. On a revenue side, we had a stronger than expected revenue streams in the local tax revenue. The earned income tax being the biggest one, biggest contributor. While it was lagging a bit during the year, by the end of the year, we ended up collecting a larger amount than we anticipated, to the tune of about $100,000 in that area. That's not that amount, but this trend has been happening for a couple years. So we believe that this is not an anomaly, but more of a sign of a growing economic base in the Pottsgrove area, in earned income at least. The second item is in property transfer taxes. Now this can be a little bit tenuous, if you will, because you generate taxes when properties change ownership, but not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily mean they're selling for more, there just maybe more sales. But in this fiscal year in particular, we had the transaction of the ownership of the Upland Square shopping center. I'm not sure if the ownership group really changed, but the name of the ownership group changed, and that stimulated a $264,000 transfer tax to the district. So that was a benefit, but it's a one-time thing that's not likely to recur again.
Mr. Nestor, sorry to interrupt, but last year there was another similar one-time event for transfer tax. I can't remember what the sale was.
I think it was the Giant.
It was the Giant shopping center.
I believe.
So
I believe it was
how
the
many
Giant
one-time
store.
events have to happen concurrently before it's not really a one-time event, or indication of a perhaps improving economy where things are happening?
Obviously, the crystal ball isn't that clear, but in the 15 years that I've been here, these are the only two significant items that have transacted.
Beyond that. Beyond that, we are seeing an increase in properties moving.
Correct.
And
we've tried to budget for that increase.
that was going to be my
But
question.
there's one, I mean, that accounted for about 60% of the collections. So we
Okay.
didn't plan for that.
Thank you.
Also on the revenue side, we received some subsidies in addition to what we anticipated from the state. We're seeing a trend in the retirement subsidy, which kind of contradicts our improving economic situation here. Historically, we've budgeted revenue for our retirement subsidy equal to 50% of our expense. That's the kind of the baseline subsidy level. However, if your market value personal income aid ratio is higher than 50%, we get reimbursed that higher percentage on a group of employees, not necessarily all of our employees, but a group of our employees. That group is getting larger, and unfortunately, our market value personal income aid ratio is getting a little bit larger, a little bit higher. So as a result, we generated more subsidy in retirement than we had budgeted for. So we're gonna factor that into our budget in the upcoming year. This is the first year that it's had any material impact on it. That generated about $155,000. In total, our revenues contributed about $412,000 of that $1.1 million surplus number. On the expenditure side, some of the areas where we had savings, our salaries came in about $141,000 below budget, which is like 0.5%. It's a very small number in total. However, our benefits came in under budget by even more. And two major contributors there were healthcare and prescription coverage. When we budgeted based on the coverage tiers that people had in place at that time. During the year, people changed coverage tiers or dropped coverage altogether, resulting in lower contributions to the healthcare system. That contributed about $150,000. And then our retirement, we tend to budget expense on all salaries, but there are groups of substitute staff, et cetera, that are not subject to supplementals, things like that, that may not be subject to retirement. So we save some money there as well. One extremely encouraging, but I'm very cautious about, trend is in the area of charter school tuitions. For the first time in as long as I can remember, our charter school tuitions went down. About $100,000 this year.
Went down last year.
I think it was below budget, but I don't think it was down. So charter school tuitions were down about $100,000 this year. Our early trends that we're looking at right now are saying that we're projecting to be over budget by the end of this year, but we'll see how many people leave during the year to see if it balances out. So those are some of the major ones. We also had some utility savings. Now that we have a little bit more history with the high school on being on board, I think we can tighten up those utilities a little bit more than we have in the past. And we did have an abnormally warm winter and cool spring, summer this last fiscal year. So our utilization was down in addition to the general deflation in utility costs over the last year. So those are some of the main drivers. But now the question for the board is, how do you best utilize this money going forward? And you have a lot of discretion, from anywhere from not doing anything to setting aside some of these monies for specific purposes.
Mr. Nestor, just one more question about this before we get on to what we're going to do with this money. And that is, isn't the actual surplus $600,000 higher when you've considered the fact that
Surplus is defined as excess of revenues over expenditures. We did project a shortfall for the year, yes, an additional $600,000, yes.
So we didn't have that $600,000 shortfall,
That's correct.
right?
That's correct.
So we didn't have to take any money out of the PSERS account
Correct.
as planned.
Correct.
So that is really another $600,000.
In accounting terms,
I don't think in
surplus-
accounting terms.
Well,
I
that's fine.
I think in total dollars.
The variance is 600,000 higher, yes.
Okay,
The surplus is the excess of revenue over expenditures, which is the 1.1.
So we only
And that's
have-
what you have control over.
so we only have to decide about the 1.1 million.
Correct,
Right,
correct.
but in fact, the school district earned or collected additional $1,000 more.
More than we
than-
anticipated.
Than we anticipated.
Yes, correct.
And what's the percentage of the surplus in that, of the budget, if you add that $600,000?
If you add the $600,000, 2.7,
Okay.
2.7. So we know there are some things that we've done in the past, which I would recommend that we continue to do. The first one being our PSERS reserve, which Mr. Rabinowitz mentioned. We had projected to use $375,000 of that PSERS reserve to offset the a budget shortfall. We didn't have a budget shortfall, so my recommendation would be to recommit that 375 for the same purpose, which would allow you to offset future budgets in that fashion. Second item that we've done in the last couple of years is we've been receiving distributions from the Western Center for surplus funds in their prior year budget. And what we've been doing is we've been earmarking those reserves to defray the future costs of budget increases or any other needs that the Western Center may have. This year we had a conversation about some mechanical control systems that might need some additional money from the districts. I would see that being a use of this money. In prior years, we had reserved some money. This year, what we received in this fiscal year was $189,173 from the Western Center. To be consistent, I would recommend that we commit that money as well. And then the last fund balance issue that I would suggest is we had a brief conversation meeting or two ago about the potential of us needing to go out and purchase new accounting software because our current vendor is putting an end of life on our product. Conservatively estimating, we're estimating that cost of a transition and all the implementation and training and whatnot to be around $200,000. So I'm suggesting that you may want to assign, not commit, but assign a portion of fund balance to offset that. And the difference between an assignment and a commitment is if you don't use the assignment for the designated purpose, let's say we never needed to purchase the software, the assignment would just go away. Whereas in the commitment, you'd have to take a board action to reverse it. It's a minor distinction, but that's the distinction. And the final recommendation I have is we know we have a extensive 10-year capital plan, and we don't have sufficient funds set aside to fund that entire plan. And this would be an opportunity to use some of the remaining surplus to fund that capital reserve via transfer to that fund. So that's my recommendation, but go ahead.
Mr. So what is our actual capital fund currently, and what is the estimated cost that we're going to need over the next so many years?
Currently, our capital reserve fund balance is about $8.6 million. But the biggest thing we're looking at right now is the roof on the middle school next summer, which is ballpark $3 million, which depletes us substantially. There are a number of other things. I don't have the laundry list of things before us, but there's roofs on other buildings. There's HVAC equipment that needs to be upgraded over time, things like that. Some large components.
What then is your recommendation as into how much should actually be in the capital fund balance?
What I had said when we were working on our strategic plan was trying to target 75% of our 10-year expenditure, and I believe our expenditures over that 10-year period were between $12 million and $15 million. So I was looking at accumulating something north of $10 million. Now, we don't need all that right away, but over time, as surpluses present, then there's an opportunity to put that money aside.
What is the time frame in which a decision needs to be made on this?
It depends on your choices. We would like to bring our audit report to the committee, to the board for approval at our next meeting. If you want to do these things based on the year that they've been incurred, we would need to make the decision tonight. If you don't make the decision tonight, these things just go to fund balance, and you could elect to transfer money to a capital reserve later, or you could elect to commit more money to the Western Center budget increase or to PSERS later, but it would take place in the next fiscal year.
Is there any risk to us if we did that as it relates to the state law pertaining to general fund balance?
If everything went to general fund balance
Now,
and before we adopted our final budget for next year, we didn't do any of these things, our fund balance would likely exceed 8%. Okay?
right.
So in the budgeted funding.
So then the time frame is somewhere between now and June 30th. The
Correct.
decision would need to be made, or we'd be at risk of having an excessive general fund balance, correct?
I don't know that I would call it excessive, but what that threshold limits you to is your ability to raise taxes.
Okay,
If
so.
you exceed, if your budgeted ending fund balance is greater than 8% in a district of our size, we're prohibited from raising property taxes.
So 2 years ago, when we faced the surplus decision at that time, I argued that we should wait to make any such decisions until a pending new board was seated. And right now we have, unless lightning strikes, 2 new board members that are going to be joining the board in December. And one of 2 board members are not going to be on the board come December, and that might be me. My point is that since this is a future-oriented decision that affects those board members, my inclination would be to wait to make this decision, as it was 2 years ago when we faced this the last time. Now, I don't think that it would be fair to those new board members to ask them to make this decision on their very first board meeting, but I just heard you say that that this decision could be made somewhere between now and June, when the budget is adopted, and no harm would come to us. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it can be deferred. The only thing that the terminology would change. We couldn't recommit 375 for appeasers because it would have lapsed.
Could we recommit the Peasers now and just defer all the other
We,
actions?
we could, yes.
I'll make a motion to recommit the Peasers.
So I'll just kind of play devil's advocate and say that we have a board full of people who have been sitting here being the studies on this stuff for the last however many years that we've been here. So bringing new people in and expecting them to make that decision in an educated way maybe not be the best way to go. But the other question I have is, does this, I thought I remembered this having some way that it weighs in with getting our audit completed, and we wanted to be able to proceed with that too.
Absolutely. If you want these items to be reflected in the June 30, 2017 audit, which they're related to, then we need to make that decision now. If we don't make that decision now, then the surplus will just fall to uncommitted, unassigned fund balance, excuse me. That doesn't prevent us from discussing this and reflecting it as a 2017-18 transaction.
What are the practical consequences of what you just said as it relates to the audit?
It's the presentation of how it is. I mean, it would be in fund balance. All of it would be in general fund balance. And we would have to reflect in the future, if we chose to transfer money to the capital reserve fund, an additional expenditure in our upcoming year's budget. That has not been budgeted for.
It's just in the presentation. It doesn't affect the outcome of the audit or how we get rated or?
No.
Okay.
No.
Well, I started with the Peasers motion because it's the no-brainer part of this. So, and to your point, one that is time sensitive. In my opinion, somebody else here could do an amended motion if they wanted to accept the recommendations of Mr. Nestor, or we could just vote on this and then continue to discuss what to do with the rest of the money. My opinion still is that that with 6 months in lead time, the new board members should be able to get up to speed and should have a voice in what we do with these funds. That's my personal opinion. It's consistent with my previous opinions, but if the rest of you don't agree, then I don't think that there's anything wrong with Mr. Nestor's recommendations other than we just raise taxes, and it always irks me when we have a big budget surplus after a tax hike. So once again, that happened. Although in this budget year, this was a 0% budget year. We didn't raise taxes, but we made estimates for this year somewhat based on projections from the previous year. So it just seems like it always happens this way. But nonetheless, we do need to fund capital. We have an ambitious 10-year plan and a $3 million route. So I think your recommendations are sound. I'm just uncomfortable making the decision completely right now, which is why I made the motion for Peasers.
And I'll just say, I mean, my concern was any undesirable or unintended consequences that may come from waiting. I'm okay with waiting if we can wait. I don't want to do it at the December 5th meeting either, right? So if we can wait long enough to get everybody up to speed, I'm fine with that. My question or concern was, is there any fallout from waiting?
I don't think they want you to do it in the December 5th meeting either, to be honest.
Yeah, I would recommend, if that's the direction you take, that we target a point in time to reintroduce the conversation and try and get it resolved, rather than having it go to the 11th hour and then trying to figure it out along with budget adoption and things like that.
A question I had in regards to the Peasers part was, how much do we have in the Peasers fund, and when is the last time we actually used the Peaser fund?
We have not used the Peasers Fund. We have $6,475,000. If this lapses, we have $6.1 million. Each year, we develop a plan on how we're going to utilize that over the years. We're going to get more aggressive with that. But if we continue to have surpluses, you know, that the use of that either lapses and then falls to fund balance, unassigned fund balance, or we recommit it and we can use it to offset a future budget. If it's in unassigned fund balance, you can still use it to offset a future budget.
What was the estimated, because I know you had a plan, I don't have the plan in front of me. What was the estimated usage for the upcoming budget? The one that's coming, not, we haven't, I understand this is real early. I'm just trying to figure out where we're at, because I know that's also going to come into play if we put the extra money in.
I believe it was $750,000 in the 17-18 budget that we were projecting to use. Now, as a result of this, since we didn't need to use this 375 last year, my projected need for the current year is going to drop too, because we only need to go up $375,000. We don't need to, right?
Couldn't we plan to use, since we've never touched this fund, couldn't we plan to use more money for a period of time to increase the relief on the budget from the increasing Peasers cost?
Yes, and I plan on doing that.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay. So this recommittal doesn't have any effect on that plan?
If I have less to use because this lapses, then yes, but it may not impact next year. It may impact somewhere down the road.
But the total you have to use is $6.4 million in theory. You're not limited to 375 because we're recommitting 375. We're just saying we're increasing the amount of money in the fund back to where it was before.
Correct.
Because of the 1 million surplus, it was my intention to request that the administration and/or us make some sort of guarantee to the community that we won't be raising taxes. However, listening to Rick, I tend to agree that the board's changing, so it may be best to make that commitment, if we do at all, with the new board. But that will be my hope for the new board. But I do agree with Rick's motion.
I'm just not comfortable making this decision tonight, personally. I think it's, you know, we didn't have a lot of time to look at this, and we've just heard the presentation. So that's a lot of money to be making a rash decision on. That's just my personal opinion.
Just to be clear, are you talking about the motion for the Peasers, or
No, I'm talking
or
about
the larger fund?
The whole shebang.
Okay. Well, that's why I just made the motion for the Peasers, right? Because that one's an easy decision, I think.
All right. I agree with Rick's sentiment that it is best to avoid decisions, usually more controversial decisions than this. I don't see a circumstance where we would significantly change your option one recommendations. That's probably where we're going to be. And it's not a redistricting decision. It's not a, new textbooks. It's a fairly standard financial thing. The sentiment behind not wanting to make decisions for the next board, I think, is a good one, and I agree with that. I think I think I'll go along with the motion to commit the Peasers. I think that's fine. Again, there's no harm there. I did want to ask one question about the committing. When we had the last facilities committee, it seems like a long time ago, we talked about the money for the roof. For the roof to happen during the 2018 summer, going to 2019, I thought that we had a timeline that was coming up close, like the November timeframe.
Yeah, I believe when we meet in November, Mr. Cardwell is going to present, as he went back to the roofing organization, they felt that some of the other structural things that were done need to be tied into the roof to make it a finished product. So he wanted to review those things with you, but we're hoping to have discussion at our, I believe it's next meeting, prior to our next meeting on the 14th, at a committee level, and then present to the board following that a plan for approving the roof and the additional components.
Okay, the things we talked about at that meeting were the roof replacement, about 2.3 million, structural repairs associated with that, that was about 600,000, window sealing, 175,000, and the other thing that we talked about as a high priority was chiller replacement at West Pottsgrove for 190,000, almost $200,000. So that's sort of the magnitude of what we're talking about for spending over the summer into next year. That's going to be a part of what we're talking about. So in excess, somewhere 3.5 to close to 4, which takes us down to half of the fund balance we have now. Okay, so that's just giving you some numbers to work with there. And then again, that number comes out of the 15 over the next 10 years. So it's all balancing and moving forward. But just wanted to give you sort of a frame of reference for it. So when you make your decision, that would factor into it, I think. The other question I have is about the PSERS. Now, the PSERS, the whole idea of setting that money aside had to do with the low interest rates that we were getting on returns on investment. Is that right?
No, it more had to do with the rapidly rising retirement contribution rates that we've been able to accommodate.
The contribution rates were a combination of things. One of them was the lower than projected interest rates that people were getting on their investments. The additional, the reduced funding from the state, more of it was passed down
Correct.
to us. What used to be called an unfunded mandate. But so that's where it came from. So we're looking a little bit better now. But where are we in terms of, sustaining that? Because we're not back to the original 5% interest rates that those things were based on, and it doesn't look as though the governor and the General Assembly are any closer to having good compromises in their budget-making process.
Actually, in ancient times, the earnings projection for the PSERS fund was 8%. They've reduced that to 7.25%. For the first time in a number of years, this year they actually exceeded. So the earnings are starting to generate, but the earnings are accumulating on something that on a fund that's underfunded by about $50 million, or $50 billion. Excuse me. It's a big number. So you're right. The growing unfunded liability is the result of some actuarial changes that took place, some market conditions that occurred, and then the unwillingness to pay the bill when the bill came due. So the good news is I hesitate to say this, we're approaching the top of the curve. But they're only looking out about 3 years at this point in time. It's going to schedule to go up somewhat each year for the next 3 years. And then if we happen to have good investment returns and we're making all of our contributions, that will level out at a little bit over a 35% employer contribution rate for the next 20 years.
Okay, so that kind of, again, gives you a little bit of context. We don't necessarily know when things are going to change drastically. This year, I think we kind of dodged a bullet with the reform and how they were going to do the taxes, income tax, or the property taxes. But something like that can come along again and change all of our projections. So you don't want to hoard too much, but you certainly don't want to, get your fund balance down to zero. So for those several reasons, I think that we're going to end up somewhere close to the option one of assessing the money basically where you said, but we'd like to give the new board members, whomever they are, an opportunity to get comfortable with the ideas and the spending and to make their suggestions and their will known. So with that being said, if we want to vote on the motion on the floor, that'd probably be a good idea.
I just want to add one quick thing. Just one quick thing with the Western Center. I just want to remind everybody that there are things that the building's getting older, and there's no reserves whatsoever over there. So if something big does happen, we're going to come back to the 3 sending schools, and we're going to need it. So I like the fact, Dave, that you put some reserves to the Western Center, because I'm starting to, wear and tear is normal. So I just want to remind everybody that we have no reserves at all, so.
Well, we still have money in the general fund balance, that if there was an emergency at the Western Center, that whether it's in capital reserve or general fund, it's available to us. Is that not true, Mr. Nestor?
That's true, but then that would not be available for in-district items as well.
Obviously,
Yeah,
but I mean, but if we're
obviously,
faced
yeah.
with,
But, yes, we,
something along the lines, it's not like whether we commit it now or not, we don't, the money is still there, I guess is what I'm saying. You know, I agree with everything that you said, Bob. And in fact, I would add that as much as part of me rebels against these surpluses, the fact is that our 15-year or 10-year capital plan for these buildings requires more money than we have right now. So if we don't have surpluses, we have a problem. And we do need to recognize that's reality. These buildings are expensive to maintain, things go bad, roofs need replacement, et cetera, and it's just a fact that we will need to live with. So I think your plan is good. I'm just uncomfortable making the decision now.
All right, so if there's no further comments or questions, then we'll move forward with the vote for the motion that's posed right now, which is to commit the, what was the exact amount? $375 to Peasers. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, that motion carries.
Mr. Nestor, I just want to make sure you have everything you need to complete the audit report now with,
yeah, unless somebody else wants to make another motion on any of the other items. That,
I just wanted as Mr. Nestor and I met last week regarding the budget surplus, I wanted to get the information out to you last week so you had a chance to look at it, and also tonight to discuss it so that we could make a decision on the audit. That's really, because I didn't want that piece to go much past tonight. I mean, obviously, you had the good discussion that we needed. I wasn't interested in ramming it down your throat at all, because Dave and I had that discussion, but we wanted to put it out there so that you had the opportunity to at least talk about it in the open forum with each other, and then we could close out our audit. So that way now we can proceed and have that presentation on the 14th. So I appreciate your efforts on that. Moving on. Any other questions? What I'd like to do is take the opportunity now to talk about the district data review. Myself and Mr. Voris and Dr. Ramage are going to, talk about this presentation a little bit. First of all, I want to thank the Curriculum Committee and Academic Committee for the work that they've done. we've been working on this since August, and we've had a lot of good discussion amongst that committee for the last 2 months. So tonight, we really just wanted to summarize the information that we have. It's coming? Okay. Obviously, with everything we do in the district, it's very important that we take a look at, we always remind ourselves in the meetings that we do, we talk about the Pottsgrove mission. And the mission of the Pottsgrove School District is to educate and inspire all students to excel as productive, responsible citizens and lifelong learners. We constantly remind ourselves of that at the district office. We also remind our teachers that the responsibility that they have to the commitment of our children. As we look at data, I am very proud to say that we've put a complete assessment procedures in place. We have district-wide assessments to allow us to evaluate our students at multiple levels. I think we have finally come to a K-12 perspective with our data. We have also looked at data at a building level, so when we do it as a district, we do it as a building, we do it at grade levels, and then, of course, we have now had the opportunities with the assessments that we have in place and the analytics that we have in place to look at students as an individual so that we can really adapt our classroom real time. Our teachers can do this real time to make decisions on what's best for students. So that's something I'm really proud of that we've accomplished in the last year, that we have this ability to do that. So as we move this forward, I will say to you this, that as Mr. Vorse goes over themes and shifts, I will say that, we own all our scores. I'm not here to say that, give you any excuses, nor is anybody that's going to present to you tonight, because I think that with our new systems that we have in place, our new curriculum we have in place, as the teachers move forward with that, and the analytics that we have in place to monitor their progress, we'll be able to make some really good decisions for our students as they go from grades 2 through 10 and matriculate through our system. As you will see, we're very close in a lot of areas. Mr. Vorse will go over that, which is something good and positive for us, and they're going to walk you through it. But we do own our scores, and we continue to look to do better every year in what we do here for students in the Pottsgrove School District. So thank you for that. Mr. Vorse? And Dr. Ramage.
Good evening. So as Dr. Schultz said, as we go through this, we just wanted to talk about a couple of things, beginning with our Curriculum, Technology, and Student Affairs Committee has spent hours really sifting through all of this data. So we appreciate their support and their work through this effort. Our goal tonight, obviously, we're going to try to provide for you in 20 minutes, hopefully, with some time for questions, what the highlights of that data looks like. However, knowing all the work that our committee has put in, the last couple meetings for your full board meeting, I've been giving you folders like this, which represent the entire contents of what that committee has been discussing throughout. So each year as we present our overall data review, you may recall that we typically start with themes. This year it's titled Themes and Shifts. And the additional word there, shifts, is to recognize some changes that have occurred at the local, state, and federal levels. So we'll talk about a couple of those as we go through this. So one of our largest shift is really there's a sense of urgency about this. And the sense of urgency is we only have students in each grade level for 1 year at a time. And we want to make sure that we're providing them everything they can, or everything we can. We want our scores to be higher. We also know that we have a lot of new resources currently in place for K through 12 English language arts as well as mathematics. So all of that coupled together, there's a sense of urgency about this, which again is reflected in the amount of time and effort that has gone in of the committee to really digging into this data. One of the reasons for that additional word there, shifts, is again some of the things that are occurring, and a lot of this is actually occurring at the local level, but at both the state and federal levels, although there's a continued focus on student achievement, there's additional focus on the word growth as well. So not only are we looking at student achievement data, but we're also looking at the amount of growth that students make not only within a particular school year, but across their career here in Pottsgrove. Pennsylvania Department of Education terms some of the students that we serve historically underperforming. That typically is students with IEPs, students from economically disadvantaged homes, students of various ethnicities. What do we know about these students? They tend to be behind their peers, and that's a phenomenon that exists across the state and really across the nation. So growing them 1 year at a time, like we want to do for the rest of their peers, isn't enough. They'll never catch up if we only grow them 1 year. So you see this additional idea that for some groups of students, growing 1 year is not enough. We need to grow them faster. So how do we do that? There's some new things, as you know, we have in place this year. So that includes measures of academic progress, the MAP assessment, as well as ECRA. And what that has allowed us to do is look at both the student achievement data as well as the growth data and begin to look at student-specific projections. Projections about how they will perform on PSSA, how they will perform on Keystone exams, how they will perform on the MAP, or any of the other assessments that we have in place on our assessment schedule. What that allows us to do, through Dr. Shirk's leadership and sort of the vision of our committee, is real-time decision-making. No longer are we in a place where we wait for PSSA scores to come in and we try to go back and fix things that may have occurred in 3rd grade, because guess what? Those kids are already in 4th grade. Now we have data at regular points across the school year during which we can stop, reflect, and provide real-time interventions to make sure that what we're doing is having a positive effect for students.
Daniel, can I just ask a question before you go into the numbers?
Please.
So I think I've been taking this word for granted, and I want to make sure that I don't, but how do we, or how does the state, or how does the nation define the word growth? So what does growth mean? Does that mean that a 2nd grade student who is right along the average has now progressed to a 3rd grade student that's right along the average, or does that mean a student that we've normed the data for, say, over the course of some period of time has now stepped off of that normed data line and started to perform better? I just want to understand what we mean by growth.
It's an excellent point. And depending upon which system that you're looking at, the word growth means something different. So it's an excellent point. So for example, if you're Pennsylvania Value-Added Assessment System, they take all the student achievement data from the state and they provide growth. But that's all through like an algorithm almost, looking at student achievement data and then assigning how much students grew. When we talk about growth in terms of ECRA, help me with the definition, it's the difference between.
Yeah, ECRA uses, well, first, to get back, just to piggyback on PVOS for a minute, they treat growth as an expected year's worth of growth, and they look for evidence that that happened. Or they could say there's evidence that it was slightly more than a year's worth of growth, and then they can also say there's strong evidence that there was more than a year's worth of growth. So when you see PVOS, you'll see it in colors, and then it kind of goes from red, which is significant evidence that a student did not make a year's worth of growth, yellow, green, light blue, dark blue. So that's how the state looks at growth.
And by that, they mean they've absorbed the amount of
They have-
knowledge and learning that's expected from during that period of time, that grade level?
They treat it and they calculate it as what they call a year's worth of growth, which kind of gets back to your initial question. So we look at 2nd grade across the state, kind of analyze. We don't have access to exactly what that algorithm looks like, but they determine a year's worth of growth, and then they measure our students against that, really just using the PSSA or Keystone assessment. I mean, that's what the state assessment is. So it is a measure of growth, but it's based on that single assessment. So it's not different necessarily than a PSSA, but it's different than a proficiency bar. So I may be struggling. I may be a historically underperforming student. I struggle to meet proficiency for 3rd grade, but I've got more than a year's worth of growth. I'm working towards getting back onto a grade level, proficiency level. ECRA uses a propensity score. We talked about, if you can remember, this is a data quiz, but it won't count towards your year's worth of growth. We have that little diagram like in the river, where you see the banks of the river and then the dots on the inside. So for ECRA, they use multiple measures, including PSSA, MAP, PSAT for an older student, whatever we have, F&P, other reading measures, whatever we can find that's a valid, reliable piece is in that analytical framework. And then they make a projection from spring to spring. So all of our students, based on what they did, if they were in the district in the 2016-17 school year, they have a projection for their growth for the 2018 spring, and then ECRA will determine whether they hit that expected growth once we have, the final data from the 17-18 school year.
And that's what we shared with our teachers right out of the gate this year, Mr. Acton, so they knew what was expected of each student in their classroom. And we
gave them that data up front, so that they knew exactly what they needed to do, how whether those kids would grow that faster. And then any data we have along the way, ECRA helps us to contextualize it. So our first map benchmark, which is finishing up here soon, there's actually there's a sort of a milestone, for lack of a better word, according to ECRA, where we can now look back and see, did a student make the projected growth, even for that small step, just here in October, and see, are we on pace? Are we helping the struggling student grow faster? Are we kind of keeping kids on pace for their growth targets?
So I want to just summarize what you just said, make sure I understand it, and make sure that it's understood. And that is that the state uses PSSAs, and based on PSSA scores alone, it gives us a measure of growth that we call PVOS. And it's a single point of data per year with our students. Keystones would be in there as well. But that's just for the post PSSA kids. So there's a little bit more data, but then again, there's less data because there's only 3 keystones. So,
to interrupt, sorry,
yeah.
They do a 1 year and they do a 3-year trend.
Okay.
And this year is the first year that there is, once again, a 3-year trend, because if you remember, our PSSA exam changed 3 years ago.
Right.
So there was a little gap there where we did not have a 3-year trend in PVOS data, but this year we do.
In contrast, what we're doing with ECRA is gathering multiple data points beyond, including the PSSAs, and we're using, I guess, what you would call a proprietary growth measurement algorithm that they call a propensity score to do hopefully a better job of both measuring and projecting the growth of our students in order to measure growth for all our students at all levels, as well as to close the gap for our historically underperforming students. Did I summarize that correctly?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any questions about themes or shifts before we go on to the actual data?
Yes. If I have, let's just kind of talk about elementary, primary students. If I have a student who doesn't understand times tables, doesn't get the idea of 3 times 5, 6 times 7, 8 times 5, can't do those basic math facts. When he moves on to the next thing, long division or long division, or adding up columns of numbers, or she is at a disadvantage. So they're below the line. How do they even catch up, let alone go beyond to where they can do the next complicated task? You know, so if you get behind in math, and the same thing would apply in language arts, if I don't know how to, conjugate my verbs, if I don't know nouns from verbs, how do I get into sentence structure, and how do I get into clauses and dependent and all of that? How do I build on things if I don't have the fundamentals? So when I understand the numbers, I get it. We've got 10 or 12 people in the high school that are short, and, that's bad because that's almost 5%. So how do we take these numbers and apply them to individuals and say, this individual needs to do more of these worksheets to get him to the point, or her, to the point where that person is on track. That's our minimum goal, and then get them back up to where they need to be for the end of the following year. How does this data get us to that point?
So I think that's a great question. In the world of education, we always have 2 moral responsibilities. One is to make sure that all kids receive on-grade level instruction in whatever grade they're at. But the other, and perhaps the more important, is to meet them where they currently are to make sure they get to that particular level. And I think that's exactly what you're describing here. So one of the pieces that we're really looking at is exactly what you're talking about, using the data that we get from MAP, because MAP is different from a typical assessment. It's different because it tells you exactly what a student is ready to learn. Not what they're proficient in, but what they are ready to learn. So as a result of that, you've heard this term differentiated instruction thrown around. Fancy term in education to mean teachers are really meeting with small groups of students to provide altered instruction based upon the child's need. It's responsive teaching, if you will. So that means now the teacher has data at multiple points throughout the year through MAP to say, this is exactly what these students need, and I can provide instruction. So I can be providing my whole group, my whole lesson to the entire class on grade level instruction, but then there's times throughout the day, small group instruction, one-on-one instruction, additional times we have after-school tutoring, all those different things that we have going on during which we can provide the students exactly what they need. So when we're talking about those students who need to grow faster, we're targeting exactly what it is that they need to help them get to that grade level. And by focusing in on exactly what they're ready to learn, now more than ever, we're able to take them further, hopefully. Would you add anything?
Yeah, the thing, I agree, and the thing, I think it's a teachable moment to remind everybody that the PSSA is a proficiency exam. So there's assessment, but there's also instruction, which is how we bridge those gaps. The MAP is it's a continuum. So when it looks at math, it says, what are these early skills? What should a student have mastery of before they can move to the next and the next and the next? And that's what the MAP allows us to do. They look over it nationally to make some grade level, norms, but fundamentally it's a test that just takes the student wherever they are, assesses that, and then helps the teacher understand, here's what they have some proficiency and some mastery of, and here's what they need next. So I'm excited to have MAP as a part of our assessment toolkit because it's a very different kind of test than a PSAT or a PSSA or a Keystone, which are all proficiency-geared assessments.
All right, so we'll start with the area of mathematics, and we'll look at PSSA first. So just as we're looking at these charts, let me explain very quickly. The column on the far left is really looking at the grade level, obviously. The next three columns are our most recent 3 years of data for PSSA in mathematics in each of those particular grade levels. The fifth column there is the state average that you can compare. What is the overall state? What does this look like across PSSAs across the entire state? So the other thing that I want to draw your attention to as you look across a particular row, so for example, grade 3, obviously in 2014-15 is a different group of kids than we have in 15-16. So from year to year, we always compare how do our third grades do from year to year, but we also look at it vertically in terms of how are third graders now doing in fourth grade, how are they then doing in fifth grade as they move through the system. The final piece before I give you a couple highlights on here, as you look at that state average column and you move down, or as you increase in grade level, you'll notice that the percent proficient and or advanced decreases. So that doesn't mean that across the state, students are learning less. And I've said this multiple times, that's a trend that exists across the state, and it's existed since, I think, the introduction of PSSA. So that has to do, in my opinion, with increasing complexity of standards, but also tests. The actual test has some possible limitations there as well. So you can see, again, that decreasing rate as you look at the state average from grade 3 through grade 8. In a couple key areas to look at, in grades 6, 7, and 8, and actually in grades 3 as well, you can see there's some increases, some of those larger than others. Grades 4 and 5, there were decreases in those particular areas. When you look at the final column and you see those areas of green, that is highlighting if we've met or exceeded the state average. So you can see in grades 5, 6, and 7, we met the state average there. Now, if you look at for example, grade 4. Grade 4, you see additional students, it says 4. That means if we were to have 4 additional students who either had a proficient or advanced score, that would also be marked green. That would have helped us meet the state average. So we gave you that to give you that piece of data as well, so that as you're looking at this, we can put it in context in terms of the overall number of students. As we look at Keystone exams for Algebra 1, please.
Any comments on the 8th grade difference between our average versus the state average?
So that's something that we're particularly looking at. That was a key area that we were looking at when we were selecting new resources last year as we went through curriculum renewal. I know our 6th, 7th, and 8th, and Dr. Ramage can talk about this too, coming out of the middle school recently, but they spent a significant amount of time really comparing what the state terms eligible content All that means is all the different items or all the different pieces of content that can show up on a PSSA or a Keystone exam. So they spend significant time looking at that, comparing that to the resources that they use, as well as to the units of study and the instruction that they have in order to make changes to that. Would you add anything coming out of the middle school?
So they did that this year?
Correct.
Well, they're always looking at which pieces are the eligible content. I think one of the shifts, if I can use that word, return us from the beginning, something that did occur as we were in the process of exploring and adapting the new curriculum that's in place right now. I think it was also sort of a freeing experience to remind teachers that the text series is a resource. We have a curriculum in play, and whatever they feel is the most effective resource to use. If you guys remember, we had conversations, for example, about the cognitive tutor, which was part of the Carnegie piece, and how it had very mixed reviews at different grade levels, and it was something that was used, per our patterns over the past couple of years, including 8th grade. I know a lot of the 8th grade team looked back and said, we're not sure that this really is effective in what we're going for in terms of our goals and our curriculum, and particularly, it was not well aligned with the PSSA. So I think at the heart of your question is, are we happy with 26, slightly less than 26% being proficient? No. We'd like to see that number increase, but by the same token, we saw a jump in 8th grade compared to the previous 8th grade. Now, I know it's a different group of students, but I mean that's a little more than a 10% rate of change if you think about it that way. It's a pretty good jump in terms of what happens with a few percentage points when we're talking about proficiency. And of course, the more you dig in to find out what's involved, I happen to notice that 1,000 is a proficient score on a PSSA at every grade level. We had 9 students at 993 or higher that missed 1,000. So part of it is not an excuse, but part of it is we have to figure out how we motivate kids to test. And when we have more families saying, don't worry about the test, or having students opt out of a test for whatever reason, it gets more and more difficult to just grab that last handful of students where we could be sitting here looking at a green bar, at 32.6%, and we still want to improve on that. But all I guess I would say is it all has to be explained. It's a single high-stakes measure. We're working to align everything we can towards it because it is important, and it's our reality in terms of one of the state's key measures, so we do want to improve that.
Well, even 32% seems like a pretty dismal number, if I do say so myself. So I just wanted to focus back on what you started with, which is looking at the eligible content. Because one explanation for the kids who got 993 instead of 1,000 is that we weren't covering all the eligible content necessary for them to get them over the hump with those scores. So the reason I asked whether it's this year is because it's obviously time critical. I guess my question is did we discover gaps in the eligible content that we were covering that explain these scores better than students aren't motivated or cognitive tutor wasn't well aligned? Because cognitive tutor might not be well aligned, but we were still covering content in other ways, and either we're covering the content necessary to get the test right, or we're not. So are we, is my question, now doing that?
Yeah. Do you want to address the pacing work?
So in answer to that question, each year we're always going back and teams of teachers meet in order to look at the eligible content and then look at their units of study to ensure everything's being met. This summer, in fact, I spent many times in classrooms with teams of teachers working on a whiteboard much like the one behind you, where they had all the standards listed out and they went across their work and they were putting green check marks or red X's to note whether or not that has been done. Over this summer, there was a heightened, although we do that every year, this summer there was a heightened focus on that particular work because we're introducing a new resource. Right. And that new resource is not our curriculum. We've talked about that. It is, in fact, a program to support the instruction. However, we know that what's being held in the hands of teachers is more likely to be taught as well. So they went through that exactly. What they did from that point is paste it to say, we're going to spend this amount of time on these particular topics. And from there, they were able to go back and look at a calendar and provide check marks to say, yes, in fact, we are hitting those areas of eligible content. In addition, just recently, the state released the blueprint for the PSSA for next year, because you know they're reducing the number of questions, in some cases as many as 20 questions in any particular area. So what that does to the blueprint is the overall percentage for which certain areas count on a PSSA. So for example, text-dependent analysis simply means that kids are able to go to a text, find an answer, and support a hypothesis or a theory that they might have. That will now count for 25%, when in the past that only counted for 19%. So teachers are looking at that specific level to say, not only are we teaching it, but how much time and effort do we need to put into it because of the emphasis that's provided on the text.
So I have a couple questions before we move on, if I can. So from what I'm hearing, we should presume then that next year's 8th grade scores will be at state average?
I'm going to steal Mr. Nestor's words. He said the crystal ball is unclear, I think earlier when he was talking about the budget. I believe you're going to see increases. I can't promise you that. I'd love to sit here next year at this time and say all this effort and time that we're putting into it, we believe is going to make a difference. But also, we know the assessment is changing once again. And what that impact has overall when you're pulling out 20 questions from an exam here or 20 from an exam there and shifting the blueprint of the test has a significant impact, not only for us, but across the state.
Well, exactly, and that's why I say compared to state average, because what affects us in that regard is going to affect everybody. Nat, just to touch on something Dr. Ramage commented on, can you just remind us the effect parents opting their students out has on our scores, and specifically parents that opt out their students that have been scoring below basic? Does that have a negative effect on our scores? How?
Loaded question, but certainly we're going to get the most representative picture of our school if we get the most representative picture of our students taking the assessments. So maybe I'll just start there. I can only speak to you from what I experienced as a principal, which was not necessarily my student historically has struggled with standardized testing, so therefore, for religious reasons or whatever they need to convey, we are no longer going to have our children participate. That's a portion of what happens, but it's not only the students who historically scored at lower levels on the test. So it's, from what I've seen, and again, I can't really speak well to what the exemptions have been at a K-5 level, a 3-5 level in this case, but I know it's been, what I've seen over the past couple of years is both an increase of the occurrence of that fact and a diversity in the kinds of testing history students bring to the table.
So am I hearing you right? Parents who have students that do or don't, but let's say they do test well, and get A's and B's on their report cards, but don't test well on the PSSAs, i.e. below basic, if they opt them out, it doesn't affect the district. And I'm not recommending or not recommending this, I'm just asking for clarity. So that does not have a negative effect on their scores or anything else for the district. Is that correct?
If I understand the heart of your question, we're not penalized necessarily, although at some point, I guess on the SPP, it would reach a point where we are actually penalized in that measure because they expect a certain percentage of participation. But in terms of these data that we're looking at, for example, it just means of all the tests taken, 32.5 across the state, that's where the mean fell. That was the average. For Pottsgrove, for all the tests taken in math in 8th grade in 2016-17, 25.8%. So it's aggregated from whatever the total number of test takers are.
So as we look at the Keystone
Just
exam-
last one,
Oh,
for, I
sorry.
hope. So we see that we're kind of tracking with the state average, not great, but kind of, all the way down through there until we have more of a disparate, a more 7%, a little over 7% gap between the state average and ours in 8th grade. And so if I've got teachers who are able to figure out the gaps in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, what's different about 8th grade? And you're telling me nothing. Occam's razor has given me a different answer.
I don't think nothing is the most accurate answer to that question. For one thing, the complexity of the test increases each year, right?
If my students are tracking along at close to 40, from 50 down to 40%, with the state average, it doesn't make sense that they would then drop 15% in the following year on the building. This goes back to what I was talking about, growth from year on year. If I'm tracking at 40%, something has to go drastically wrong to drop 15% in my student achievement on what they should be learning the next year. Your tendency should tell you that kid's going to be staying on track from 40% one year to 40% the next year. So why is it dropping 15%?
Well, part goes back to what Mr. Vorse mentioned earlier. You would, if it was just flat all the way around, you'd say, well, kids in 4th grade score a little over 50% are proficient, so kids in 4th grade, a little over 50% should be proficient. That's not what happens with the test. If you look at the trends in the test, it continues to be fewer and fewer and fewer, and even just the way that they come up with a norm is a little bit controversial in what they call chaptering, where they set these cut scores. You would expect on a proficiency exam that you would say, here's what a 3rd grader should know, or an 8th grader, or a 6th grader. And if they get this amount, we're going to say they're proficient. That's not the way the state has actually determined proficiency. So there's a lot of factors involved in how, again, I want to be the last person to come to the table and say, well, here's why we're missing it, don't worry about it. We want these students to achieve at this level, and we feel that we should be hitting, as Dr. Shirk has said before, green across the screen. State average is a good benchmark for us to shoot for in each case. So we're pushing for that. But there are a lot of factors involved besides the fact that they just scored at a certain level a year before. And kids who are close, they're gonna lose more than they would normally lose if you think about it as the test complexity increases. So, it's not like if we're testing times tables, it's not like the test gives them a blank table and says, now fill in the 3 times whatevers.
Mm-hmm.
So even how they're assessing it, that's one of the things that we continually look at. It's been 3 years for this new test, so we have 2 sets of what the state calls released items. Every time there's a released items, teachers huddle around and go, wow, so here's how they're going to check fractions and multiplication and algebraic sense and measurement and geometry. We only see the released items. We can't keep a PSSA. We can't pour over a PSSA. These things there's high test security. So even just helping students understand what the test is going to ask them to demonstrate proficiency in the state standards is a factor that gets more and more complex as they go up through the grade levels. So I'm not trying to dismiss your question. I'm at the heart of it, I feel your frustration in the same way, but it gets harder and harder as they go up through the grade levels. We saw the same trend when there used to be an 11th grade PSSA. You think, oh my gosh, how we have these kids so well set up. If you remember the old numbers at the middle level, we're hitting around 80% for a lot of measures. And then all of a sudden, boom, every high school across the state would see a drop in 11th grade. Why? Well, now 8th grade happens to be the last stop. And I think we see it there in a similar pattern as they just keep moving that complexity up to the last level of testing to try to get all that in.
Dr. Ramage, I'm sorry, one more question occurred. I'm sorry to you too, Jim. Could the fact that we advance some of our students in the 5th and 6th grades and compress the Common Core math that they take into 1 year or 2 years, and then they move on to algebra and geometry when they're in 7th and 8th. Could that have a deleterious effect potentially on their results? And they're typically our best math students. So even a drop-off there
Yeah.
could, have we looked at that
Yeah.
as
I'm not-
as a contributing factor?
I'm not aware of a student that has not been proficient on the grade level. But
Not so
what-
many advanced.
What is interesting is the state's answer is an eighth grader must take an eighth grade math PSSA, no matter what their math is. So we have some eighth graders in algebra, we have some in geometry, we've had eighth graders take algebra too. They all have to take the eighth grade PSSA. What we have noticed, which seems a little out of whack, is we don't have all of our highest performing math students hitting advanced on that grade level piece, which seems counterintuitive. But I'm not aware of any that have not, I mean, we'd have to look back over the archives, but I'm not aware of anyone who hasn't been proficient on the state test.
Fair enough.
But you would expect when they're advanced on a keystone, for example, and only, I think 2 years ago, it was close to 50% were only proficient and not advanced on the grade level test. So in some ways, it's like, how much math have you forgotten?
Well, that's
in a
where I was
way,
going, that,
which
right.
I think is a part of your
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
You know, how much specific detail have you missed, even though you're able to perform geometry? Are you really sharp on all the algebra pieces that would show up in an eighth grade PSSA?
All right, well, I'll shut up so you guys can get going with this.
All right, moving on, Keystone exam, Algebra 1. So as we talk about Keystone exams, we already talked a little bit about a couple of things that are swirling around about this. The first being, you'll recall in the past, it was a graduation requirement. So that's sort of on hold in terms of calling that a graduation requirement. The other thing that's happened as we look at Keystone exams is we used to have, in the past, we would have to provide remediation, and it was mandated that the student they were required to attend that remediation after a less than proficient score on a Keystone exam. That also has changed. In addition to, there's a kind of a murmur across the state about the future of Keystone exams. So you'll hear that come up often about, will they be around in 2 years or 3 years? Again, nobody knows the answer to that question, but all of that kind of contributes to this. We use them as indicators, absolutely, but at the same point in time, there's a lot going on in addition to parents opting out, which is not only increased here in Pottsgrove, but across the state as well. So as we look at Keystone exam for Algebra 1, we were pleased that between the 15-16 year and the 16-17 year, you note an increase there. So a couple of reasons for that, and I'll jump to the next slide, and we talked about some of this already.
Can I just ask?
Sure.
Why don't we have state averages, sorry if it's a stupid question, for the Keystone?
Actually, we do. Actually, if you look in the one document I provided for you, the state average, and this is actually, we don't have the state average for first-time test takers. What we have is the state average for the overall cumulative. So if you remember, kids can bank their score until their 11th grade year. So we have the state averages for that, but not for the first-time test takers. What I was showing you on this slide is our first-time test takers, because that's really what we have the largest amount of control over. So as we look at this and we talk about things that we're doing, and we'll call them improvement plans, you know we spent a lot of time last year looking at new resources, looking at our approach to instruction, and the resources we were going to use to help students with that. So we've implemented new resources. None of these resources were in place until the beginning of this year, so these scores don't reflect that. A significant amount of work in terms of pacing again, the eligible content piece, took place over the summer, and that took place across the board as teams were really mapping this out, what was their year going to look like, and continues actually right throughout this year. In fact, as we come upon the November 7th Staff Development Day, teachers will be sitting around the table and saying, okay, we're 3 months in at this point, or almost 3 months in at this point. What do we have to do? What do we have to adjust? Where do we notice kids falling down, if you will, and how do we pick them up in those particular areas? Last year, as you recall, we were living with the 1.5 last year, but what we said to teachers, we gave them the freedom to get it done, if you will. So in the past, it was kind of prescribed for them in terms of using Carnegie as well as Cognitive Tutor. We kind of said, you're a professional. We have resources in place to do what you need to do in order to meet the needs of your students. And then going through the high school course proposal, you'll remember that we added some things in, like Algebra 1A and Algebra 1B, to support our lower level students who are learning algebra as well. Our special education department is really heading up, looking specifically at interventions, following a very similar path to what we did with looking at our new resources for core instruction. The idea there is that when kids need an intervention, they can step into that intervention and they can kind of step in and out of the core. Our end goal is always to have our special education students in the regular education setting as much as possible. So we want to make sure that those interventions communicate, if you will, with the same resources that we're using in the regular education setting. So if we need to provide intervention, we can do that, but the student's able to kind of step in and out of that and not lose track. And then the final piece is just the vertical articulation. So again, not only looking at what happens in one particular grade level, but our 6th grade teachers talking to not only 5th grade teachers, but also the 7th grade teachers to talk about where the kids have been, where they're going, and what do I have to do as a teacher to make sure I kind of marry those. Questions about that before I move on to the English language arts? All right, so as we look at the English language arts table, I won't explain. Again, you'll notice that you have the 3 most recent years of data. You have the state average again in your right-hand column there. And then the final column again is additional students. So as we're looking at English language arts, a couple things that call to your attention. So we see some, between the 15-16 year and the 16-17 year, you can see that in the areas of grade 3, 6, 7, and 8, we notice an increase in terms of those scores. In grades 4 and 5, we went down a little bit. Now, looking again at that additional students, for example, in grade 3, 2 more students who had gotten a proficient or advanced score, we would have met the state average in that particular piece. And I've shared this, I know, at the committee meeting. One of the things that we notice in our district is we have a lot of students that are very close to proficiency. So as Dr. Ramage said, if that's cut score is 1,000, we have a lot of kids sitting in the 990s. So there's a handful of kids right there in terms of looking at 2 more. One of the things that we did last year and we challenged our teachers to continue with this year is sometimes when you're looking at, okay, I have to get to 65%, it can kind of be overwhelming for a teacher, or we say, let's shoot for 70. But when we drill it down to additional students, it becomes much more manageable. So for example, if we're talking 2 more students across grade 3, everybody focused in on 2 more is what we called it last year, through which they were designing interventions for those 2 additional students so that they were really clear. We again started off this year in a very similar manner. The only difference is they had much more data in front of them in terms of PSSA, MAP, ECRA data as well, so that they could be very specific about how they were going to intervene for kids. You can see in grade 6 we met the state average there. And then as we look at Keystone exam for literature, we see a drop off there. So this is something that I know Dr. Ziegler and I are already talking about with Dr. Shirk in terms of looking at that. We know there's a lot of factors surrounding the Keystone exam, right? And I mentioned some of those as we talked about algebra. However, we also don't like to see a decrease, right? And we also know that by and large, our department remained fairly similar. So we're working to explain that beyond some of those kind of factors that we have going on across the state when we talk about Keystone exams.
This was first-time test takers again, right?
That's
so there's
correct.
no state average to compare it to.
That's correct.
Right. Okay.
When you look at the overall for literature, for the bank score, it's 72%. State average in that case is 72%. So when you're looking at that, we met the state average.
One of the things you had brought up at the curriculum meeting, just want to mention, when you were talking about identifying 2 students or 6 students or 4 students, pinpointing, you pointed out that it was not at the exclusion of ignoring those above. So just wanted to, the whole idea was that being able to focus on them while at the same with exactly their needs, while attending to the rest as well. So
Absolutely.
We're looking at our curriculum specifically as it relates to this drop in performance? As it, I
You
mean,
at the high school level?
at the high
In
school,
terms of
when
the
we didn't
concern
change our
we are?
resources at the high school.
We did not change our resources. However, that did not exclude that department from really diving deeply, like all of our other grade levels did, in terms of mapping out, looking at pacing, looking at eligible content.
I mean, I don't want to get on a soapbox, but to the extent that, that we continue to test students on the content of what they read, for example, and their recall of that content, rather than teaching them to analyze passages of text, well, we're going to continue to do poorly because the Keystone exam is structured, as are the other tests that they'll take, in such a way that they need to have the skill to take any piece of text with no background information available to them, analyze it, and then answer questions about it. And it's a different skill than reading Huck Finn and then telling you what happened in Huck Finn. So I just want to make sure that we're on point with that, because I'm sorry, we're just not going to get better unless we recognize that fact.
Sure. One thing I would say as we're going through, again, this to me is an important theme, an overarching piece. You know, triangulation is something we've heard a couple times. When you're looking at research, you're trying to find a couple points. So one of the things that intrigues me, that I question, is how would our first-time test takers here score at this rate when we look at, say, PSAT scores across all of students taking it, which was somewhere in the 270s, I believe. I don't have those numbers in front of me. We outscore national norms on the PSAT across the board. Our lowest students score higher than the 25th percentile. We'll see some of this with math later. So when we see students who are able to take a PSAT or an SAT and meet the language portion at much higher rates, you know, comparatively than we're seeing in terms of some of the state testing, again, to me it raises a question: are they really lacking the skills? I'm sure there's always a need. There's always room to improve skills. That's true for me. That's true for all of us. That's true for our students. But I think it's more than just that. When we see other points of data that seem to indicate some decent achievement from our students in other arenas. But and as the shift in the state moved to more complex questioning, absolutely. That's where the TDA in our 3rd through 8th grade PSA tests in ELA are going to come to bear potentially a year from now, because they're making more and more of a weighting towards exactly that kind of a question. So we're trying to keep that in focus.
But it's not just the complexity of the questions. It's how
a different skill.
It's a different skill than reading and recalling. Mm-hmm. Reading and recalling does not help you on the Keystone. I mean, yes, the reading portion does, but the recalling part and the background information doesn't. And so if and I don't know what the numbers are, but if our language arts teachers spend 25% of their time testing our students on reading and recalling, then they're wasting time that could be spent developing the skill necessary to do well on that test. And we could argue that that test is going to go away at some point in the future. But right now, this is what this school district is measured at. And what's more is it's an important skill for success as students go beyond high school. So I'm suggesting that the answer might be very obvious if somebody would just take a look at it. So there, off my soapbox again.
Okay, so moving on to science. As a reminder, science, there's really just 2 indicators in grades 4 and 8, well, 3, and then you look at the Keystone exam for biology. So one thing that I noticed when I was looking at state averages from year to year, they were fairly consistent from 15-16 to 16-17. Not a whole lot of change in state averages for either English language arts or for math. State averages across the state for PSSA went down. Now, you can kind of see a downward trend that we're on in this particular piece. There's no excuses in that particular area. So again, we've continued to look at the the pacing, we continue to look at the instruction, we continue to look at the standards. And this year, we are on track to get to go through the process of curriculum renewal for science. While we've had some focused groups looking at this, we haven't had the level of what our math and ELA folks did last year in really looking at their particular resources to make sure that we're kind of up to par there. So that's the process we will go through this year, really looking at our science, because that's part of one of the content areas that's up for curriculum renewal. So as we look, again, when I talk about these improvement plans, I don't want to say it's more of the same, because there's a lot of work that's captured in all these particular bullet points. But again, there's new resources that really took place for English Language Arts K-8. However, exactly as Mr. Rabinowitz was suggesting, K-12, we're looking at all those particular areas. And that includes the eligible content again, it includes the pacing. Again, our special education team, just like we're doing for math, also on the English Language Arts side, looking at that particular piece, and then again, considering that vertical articulation so that we're clear about what does learning look like K through 12 for students in terms of English Language Arts learning, or science learning, or math learning.
So one of the questions that came up in the committee meeting was about, comparison, this more than just the state average, but about area schools. And when we had the opportunity to get some state release data around other 3rd through 5th or 6th through 8th kind of groupings across the state, that's really what the next slides relate to. And I know you're not necessarily going to be able to read that slide at a presentation level, but we wanted to give you a sense, and you have it in your packets. Above the first blue line are elementary schools, and you'll see that Lower Pottsgrove is highlighted with the gray bar to show you where they fall. The schools are listed in order based on their percentage of students who are proficient or advanced in the PSSA math for that school. So this is not a grade level, but this is for a school level. And you'll see the county, the district name, the school name, and some of the factors that relate to the historically underperforming students. Because that's, it is a question that we also want to answer. How can we help the students who are furthest behind, not to ignore other students, including our most advanced students, but how can we help those students who are definitely behind grade level? And are there other schools with a high, historically underperforming population where we can gain some insights and skills for how they may be accomplishing that work? So that's really the heart of what these next couple slides are about. And will you find someone who's laid out with exactly the same setting and context as, say, Lower Pottsgrove? Well, there are schools that are similar or close, and that's kind of what the purpose of this table is, to be able to look across and see who may have a similar economically disadvantaged population. So, for example, just by way of an example, if you look at about halfway down, you'll see Franklin Elementary School at about 48%, where we are around 43%. You'll see EMC Crownhamel from Souderton School District, about 46%. You see one of the Cheltenham Elementary Schools around 31%. Those are schools in some ways similar. Now, I know you can't find exact demographics all the way across the board, but at least in those contexts, we've outscored a school like that. You can look down below and see right below us is Schuylkill Haven with almost an identical 40.1, 42.3. They're scoring above us. But everything everything above us is, I just looked across for demographics that were similar, and then I looked for achievement that was within a point or two of our schools just to begin to grab some comparative data. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I interesting to note, those above us is less than half a point in each case. Even those with higher economical disadvantaged, they might be higher, but it's less than 0.5%. So really, to me, it's a wash.
Well, that's what I'm saying. You have to look at across all. So some above us are at lower rates, right? Like the Cheltenham School, for example. Some are at similar rates, but scored, significantly lower, over 6 points lower in the case of Franklin. So again, it's not I don't think it's a single measure. You don't just go up and down the column and say, what's their economically disadvantaged population, but it gives us a chance to see. And I do agree in the sense that look at a school like, Pocono Mountain, Tobyhanna Elementary Center. High percentage of economically disadvantaged students, and yet they're scoring, higher than we're scoring by half a point. So what are they doing well? What could we learn maybe from that elementary center in terms of working with kids coming from a background in poverty? So I do agree. I think, this is relatively new data that were released for us. We're trying to get a way to look over the data and make some contacts with some of these schools so that moving forward, as we do curriculum visits, for example, there are some places here that we have not necessarily had on our radar. Now I would say these are schools to have on the radar. Would they be willing to let us come in and look at their science curriculum, their math curriculum? That's kind of the point. And then you'll see a similar set of school. Oh, somebody had a question. Did they? Moving forward. Hearing no questions, let me move forward. You'll see similar then that bottom, between the two blue bands on the bottom, you'll see Pottsgrove Middle School highlighted in gray. And again, trying to find some similar bands of economically disadvantaged or minority populations for comparative purposes. Here, some of these who are at a slightly less level of economically disadvantaged population aren't scoring that much higher, and I find some of that encouraging. So it goes in both directions. Some schools are overcoming more challenges than we are, and some are, perhaps a little more well-positioned to achieve, and they're not achieving at as high a rate as I would think. If I can throw my neighboring to my home school, North Penn, under the bus, for example, I mean, it's higher than we are, but wow, I would expect in a high achieving district like that, I'd want to see perhaps maybe a little more. So maybe they'll come and visit us. I don't know. Any questions about this table? And then basically, if you look at the next slide, it's the same approach, but this time it's with ELA. So you'll see the scores are reflected in terms of the school level changes for our schools, and you see some similar schools, but you see kind of a new set of schools. So again, it could be that there's some schools that are doing math really well. Others may be really helping with some of the issues Mr. Rabinowitz spoke about. How are they getting kids to actually analyze text and multiple text at a high level? So we hope that gathering some of these data points for the first time with this kind of intentionality will help us as we move forward. Okay? And then sort of the last of the 2 through 8 kind of data focus is the MAP piece. And I know we've discussed recently about trying to move this up. And again, I'll remind you, MAP is not really a proficiency assessment, but after second graders all over the United States take a MAP assessment, they are able to say, well, here's what the mean looks like for a second grader. Here's what it looks like for a fifth grader, for an eighth grader. So that's what these dots represent. And if you look at the gray, the lighter gray behind the chart, that represents the very bottom with the dashed red line. You'll see where it says 1. That is representing the 5th percentile, the lowest 5th percentile of test takers. The next gray line up is the 25th percentile, the 50th, the 75th, and then actually the 95th, even though it says 1 and 99. So basically visually what this chart represents is you can see that in almost every grade level at every percentile, our Pottsgrove students are scoring at a higher level than the national level, okay? So for example, if you want to pick a nice highlight, you can look at that green dot sort of right in the middle of the whole chart that says, for fifth graders taking a math assessment in MAP, our students who score smack dab in the middle, the 50th percentile, score at a higher rate than all the other fifth graders taking that test who fall at the 50th percentile. So our kids average 68 across the national norm that would be 50. There are other places where we would fall behind. If you look at second grade at the 75th percentile, our relatively high achieving students are actually scoring a little bit below the 75th percentile. So while most second graders at that percentile are hitting the 75, we're scoring a 72. I have the numbers written on here, so I'm cheating on my chart. So again, just another way to look across and try to help us as we plan and make some sense of the data. It's another data point. It's a comparative point that we can look at and say, wow, I just looked across, our 8th graders are struggling in math, right? We just had that conversation earlier. Yet, when I look at the 8th grade performance on a MAP assessment, they happen to be, aside from the highest percentile, our 95th percentile kids score at 93. At every other quintile across the test, they score at or above the averages for those nationally. So again, it's just another way that we're trying to dig in and get an explanation of what the numbers look like and help to make sense of these data points. Any questions on the map? And then you'll see the next slide is exactly the same comparative data for the reading test. We see a nice bump in 5th grade again, which is a nice trend. You'll notice in both math and ELA. And then the last data points are at the high school level. We have, which again, you've seen these pieces, but the advanced placement exams. And you can see the total AP students, the number of exams taken, and the students who have scored a 3 or higher, and what those percentages look like. Again, we have a historical trend there from 2013, but you can see at least through last year there was a nice bump from the 2016 exams into the 2017 year. That just represents all AP exams. And then the following slide shows Pottsgrove High School, Pennsylvania average, and then the global average for all students taking the AP exams. And again, that's a really nice nice performance as a high school compared to, say, Pennsylvania or the global average for students taking AP exams in 2017.
So I have a question real quick. Oh yeah, over here. No. Yeah. I don't usually ask a lot of questions. So I'm just going to ask one about, it's actually on the slide before this one, where it says the total of AP students. So for the number, so it says for the AP students with the scores of 3 or higher, my question is, what is the total number of exams with a 3 or higher? Because one kid could take like 3 tests, do really well, get a 5 on the one, and then get 2s on the other 2. You know?
So that student would only be counted for the test. The 103 is the number of scores.
Not the number of students.
This is the number of scores at or above 3.
These students with scores.
Or, I'm sorry, students,
Yeah.
AP students with 3 or higher. So they may not have scored every exam 3 or higher.
So if a student took 5 tests and got 3 or higher on all 5, they're only counted once.
Students.
That last
AP students, yes.
Okay.
So an interesting additional row of data would be number of exams with a 3 or higher. Because we have number of exams taken, so we have, yeah, okay.
Right. The full AP report is in that data folder, and we went through it as a committee, but I don't have those pieces in front of me right now.
We can share that with you next. We have that, yeah. Yeah, we have. Yep.
Questions on the AP piece? again, nice accommodation in terms of the trends there with the high school. And then the last data slide, number slide, is the SAT data coming across. And again, this alludes to a little bit what I was mentioning before. If you look across the top indicator is Pottsgrove High School, then the Pennsylvania, and then all students taking the SATs. 84% of Pottsgrove students met the reading benchmark, compared to 75% across Pennsylvania and 70% of all SAT test takers last year. And 61% met the math. I think we're closing out at the end of the data presentation. I can't speak anymore. 61% met the math proficiency benchmark, compared to 52% of Pennsylvania students and 50% overall. Now, I know these are high school students, not eighth graders. I get it, but I'm just saying in terms of our multiple measures, we see a lot of indicators that we're performing at pretty good levels in other assessments, and we don't always necessarily see that on the state assessments. So it's important for us to focus on all, but I find a little encouragement in the fact that there's at least disparity in the lower numbers from one particular assessment that we may be able to balance out.
I wonder if anybody would be interested in writing an article or doing a press release for the media pointing out that exact point that you just made, especially with the evidence. We have black and white data to support that. Look, PSSA shows this, but let's look at these other scores. And even, I mean, that's one point. My second point is, bringing this sort of information to the legislator, like, to prove what we're saying, that PSSA is a.
We've done that. Just with my relationship with Senator Mensch and the Education Committee, with Senator Dinniman, they understand it. It's just getting it to where it needs to be. And they understand what we're doing with multiple measures of assessment. And so they tell me they're trying, and I'm going to meet with them at the end of November, so we'll see if we get an update of any more I can share back with the board.
And the closing piece is just, again, a reminder, even if we look across the Every Student Succeeds Act, the new federal piece, there's much more emphasis on growth. And if you think about it, it makes sense. We don't want to just have kids who maybe came from a household where there's a lot of reading and a lot of focus on what it means to analyze literature, and they just kind of show up and take the exam and they're proficient, and thank you very much, see you later. We want a student who's right in the middle of the band to grow while they're with us. We want a student who's way off the edges, accelerated, achieving at high levels, to grow while they're with us, not just give them a diploma and say good luck at college. And we want the kids who are struggling to grow faster. So the growth measure, I think, is a really good way to approach student achievement. We want every student to grow. We know we need some to grow at faster rates than others just to meet those proficiency benchmarks and to be equipped when they do graduate and head to the workforce. So we're paying particular attention to what Pennsylvania calls historically underperforming groups, and we're trying to look at those gaps and move them forward and minimize them. And historically, we've done some of that well, and there's other groups that we have not done as well, and even that varies year to year. So we continue to look at those data points and make that a goal. Any other questions? We have you want to talk about that last one? Do we have an improvement plan slide? Okay. Again, it all relates to what I just mentioned, the achievement gap. So we have the measure like the MAP benchmark. We have the analytical framework of ECRA to help us to be more dynamic in terms of those plans instead of just looking at year-end data. I mean, some of these data points we have here tonight, we literally just received them a week ago from the state. It's kind of hard to plan fourth grade from last year's third graders if we're not even getting some of these points till now. So by putting these frameworks in place, it really helps us to intervene more purposefully. We always have intervened. When a kid struggles, we intervene. But if we're trying to make it align well with some of the state assessments that we're going to be measured against, that's what the framework is really going to help us to do. And I know it's, Dr. Shirk's goals align well. It's all connected. It's all tied together as we work for our students' best achievement.
Thank you both.
Yeah, great presentation. There's a lot involved there.
Grab some water, will you? Okay, we're going to move on with the Section 5, the report of the superintendent. These are action items regarding personnel.
I'd like to make a motion, that we approve all 5, which includes 5.1 through
5.8.
5.8.
Second.
5.7. Can we hold that 5.3?
5.3?
Okay.
This is our motion and second to combine all of 5 withholding 5.3.
Sure.
Correct.
Any questions or comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, back to 5.3.
I'll just ask my question now, I guess. Was this budgeted for, 5.3, the tutoring?
Yes.
Okay. If it's not difficult, could we add that comment in when we're voting to spend money on something? Just, be easier. Okay, motion to approve 5.3.
Motion and a second, and not a comment on the item, but maybe it would be, just a thought, it might be easier to just note if it's something that's not budgeted for. Because, I mean, I think, I've asked that question myself many times, and it's always yes, but if something's not, if it's something off budget, then they let us know. Okay. Okay, for 5.3 then, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
Okay, moving on to Section 6, action items for business. We ask the board to approve security services agreements with Advanced Protection Company for the 17-18 school year as presented.
Motion and a second for 6.1. Any comments or questions?
Question. Does any of this come out of the athletic budget?
I believe, I believe the majority of it comes out of, a 2660 account, which is security services, but the game security does come out of athletics.
Any other questions or comments? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay.
Number 7, action items for education. This is regarding,
And I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve 7.1 through 3 for conference attendance. Any questions or comments? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes.
action item number 8 for regarding policies. We ask the board to approve the revised policy number 904, public attendance at community events as submitted.
Second. Okay, motion and a second. Any questions or comments on this policy? All in
If you could-
favor?
Real quick, if you could just clarify the difference, so just for the public, so they understand what the difference is. Go from 65 to 55.
Well, I know, sure, do you want to, go ahead, Bob.
Just the number, the age, it was reduced.
wanted to tell the public, I know it.
It's been practiced that 55 years of age have received the maroon and white cards. It's now part of policy. We made policy to match practice.
All in favor for 8.1? Aye. Opposed?
No.
Okay.
Section 9, committee items. We'd like to have Mr. Leach give the report of the Curriculum Technology Student Affairs Committee.
All right. First, I wanted to make sure I thanked everybody that was there for the curriculum meeting. We also had some teachers that were there involved and such like that. And I'm going to skip over the data part of review. I think we've already covered enough of that. Just for the other people that are not here, we spent maybe 7, 8 hours on the data. So if you want to come, you're more than welcome.
And we congratulate you.
So you're more than welcome to come. The piece I do want to actually highlight is going to be the course review that we're going to be sending to the board at the next meeting. There is 2 particular courses. It's actually 1 course, but 2 years covering. It's going to be what's called the AP Capstone. Generally, if you've always probably known, we usually go to the board in February for the particular class. And this year, we're coming to the board a little bit earlier so we can give everybody more time to prepare and get the word out. So we're going to be coming to the board at the next meeting, which would be in November versus the normal time from February. What this particular class is going to be increase our APs, if I'm not mistaken, to approximately 18 now APs that will be covered throughout our school. So that's actually, I think, a very good thing. And this course is going to be 2 levels. It's going to be AP Capstone, it's going to be research and seminar. The first course that's going to be introduced is going to be AP Seminar, which will be starting next year. And the AP Research is going to be following that up in the next year. So AP Seminar this year, coming up, 2018-19. The Research, 1920. Now, there's a lot of questions in regards to how valuable this course is going to be for some of our students. And you guys can read over the different things that this is going to be. It's going to really develop our students in how they can go in the research topics, presentation, writing. It really encapsulates a lot of different aspects of our students and help them to develop to become better and all around. It's not just going to make them better in English, but it's going to make them better in all their subjects and learning how to research and learning how to write. Originally, this class is going to start as an ELA elective, but there is an option possibly to make this also a science elective as well, depending on the value. As in, currently what we have is the teacher that's going to be teaching it, Miss Patty Carroll, it has the AP ELA certificate. So she'll be doing the ELA part. If, however, we see that we have enough students that are going to want to do maybe a science section, then we could also offer a science AP teacher to do that as well. So we could end up having 2 extra classes on top of that. So it's just there. There are some questions that still have to be developed, and obviously we're going to get those answers for the rest of the board because I know there are some, as in whether or not this will be considered part of the major, as in count towards graduation and such, or this will be straight elective only. Obviously, we have some students that are on the track of AP classes, whereas they would be taking their honors intensive in 9, AP maybe in 10, AP maybe in 11, and then 12th grade, we didn't really have a spot for them if they're on that track. We do have classes online. We're not sure yet if this would count. Dr. Ziegler is going to look into that and with Mrs. Voorhis and stuff like that. So we'll go over that, different things. But generally, this class is going to be for your 11th and 12th grade students. So we're looking at an enhancement to our 11th and 12th grade students. If anybody has any questions, of course, please ask those because this will come to the board at the next meeting. Lastly, of course, I'm not going into the data part, is the curriculum update. Obviously, we've probably, if you haven't already heard, we're going to start the next year's process, which we're going to be going over the science, the world language, visual arts, and health. That's the next batch of curriculum that we're going to be going over. We're going to follow, obviously, the same plan that we followed with the math and the English last year, as in making sure we have full support and have the teachers have the skin in the game, and for them to be the ones that are really picking and choosing what curriculum is going to be best for our students. Lastly, of course...
Question on that.
Go
What's
ahead.
your time frame with the curriculum review?
With the curriculum, the timeframe for science, world language, visual arts, and health is going to be to follow the same as we did last year. It's already started. It'll start in November and stuff, and then it'll follow through the entire course of the year, and then at the end of the year, we'll come back to the board with the recommended from the teachers and such as into what, or if any, programs need to be changed, just like we did with the ELA and the math last year. So it's going to be pretty much a whole year plan again. Lastly, of course, is our third language timelines. As you see, we're going to already develop our classwork, since we're already coming to the board of what classes we're looking to bring next year. World language right now, bringing in that third language is not necessarily eliminated yet, but we do know we need more time to develop the program to make sure that we do this correctly, because we definitely want to look into, and I know the board is very excited about possibly bringing that back, and we understand the ramifications of such, especially also the community impact and how they suggested they would like to go to it. But we do also want to make sure we're following the right protocols and make sure we do this correctly. So we're going to take our time and make sure we get this all back to the board at the exact time. Does anybody have any questions in regards to any of those?
I'd just like to say that, just to put this out there, you know, the capstone is a nice idea, but I still think it's a huge, we're missing a big chunk in 12th grade English by not having an honors 12. I mean, to me, I don't understand why. There's AP, there's academic.
Completely understood. That was an exact
And now
part-
we're adding yet another high-level English, but we're still missing that big middle part there, where the kids who aren't quite ready for, you know, AP, or maybe they took an AP in 11th, you know, AP, either lit or comp, and they just said, yeah, not quite for me, and then they're back in academic, because that's their only choice. So I don't understand. I think that's a big chunk that needs to be addressed at some point.
And I can understand the question. It was actually brought up exactly like that, as into, are we missing any students? You know, we have the academic 12th grade, and we go right to the APs. In talking to the AEL teachers that were there, they both, along with Mr. Voorhees, all agreed that we definitely are, they believe that they are covering the full gambit of students and making sure that we have the students correctly placed. So they didn't see the need to add on that course at the time. Doesn't mean we can't keep evaluating, keep looking at it, but at the present time, they didn't feel it was warranted for the class students that we have currently in the system.
I think it might be a good idea to maybe poll the students, maybe current 12th grade academic students, ask how many of them would have taken honors had it been offered. Because I know my daughter would be in honors right now if it was offered. And she said quite a few of the kids in her class would also be in honors with her if it was offered. So might be a good idea to talk to the students, and, you know, they know best where they would be, I think, rather than the teachers.
And then I just wanted to say that I am a big proponent of capstone. I think the skills that it teaches are very relevant, not just for success here, but for success beyond here. And so I'm enthused about the plans to bring it here, although I couldn't disagree more with the notion that it's an elective and that a student would have to take capstone and then also have to take another English course. It just makes no sense to me that we would do that. And in fact, the one close school district to us that does have capstone, in fact, they just implemented it this year, it does count as a major, not as an elective, and that's Springport. So respectfully, I'll be voting no if it comes before me as it's currently designed, even though I very much want to add it, because I don't think that the design is practical. I don't think our students will take the course when they also have to take another English, and I don't think it's fair that we would turn this year-long commitment to high-level English language arts into an elective.
To your point about it counting as a major class for ELA, That was a question, because it was understood at the curriculum meeting that there could be circumstances where it would count as an English class. And right now, Dr. Ziegler is researching that, just to trying to give more detail on that, because it is a very valid point. So trying to find out more about that, so.
Well, in my opinion, it shouldn't be on a case-by-case. It should be all the time. If a student chooses to take capstone, they might also choose to take some other English language arts because they're specializing in that area. But for a student who takes capstone as their only English, it should count to satisfy their English requirement for that year. They have to take 4 years of English, and capstone is just as valid as any other, in my humble opinion.
Part of the idea with that is that with those going through more of a science track, they're able to double up on science. So there would be cases where they might want to double up in English, but it's an option for them to do that. So yes, I agree. I think having it count as an actual English class, so that they're not required to double on English when they really are looking towards going STEM, then they're losing out on some sort of science course that will help them later on when they get to college, and so.
Well, also, they're not required to take 4 years of science, are they?
No, that's true.
Yeah.
Although they do because they want to.
They do because they want to, and maybe some of the English language arts students would do the same, and that's fine. I'm just saying that if a student just wants to take one English so they could squeeze in all their other science, that it should count if they choose capstone. I feel very strongly about it, and I hear what you're saying, but that's the difference to me.
Right now, we're waiting to hear back, so. We're good. All right, thanks, Al. In any way.
Okay, well, we're moving in now to new business. Go around the horn. Does anybody have new business that they want to present for tonight?
I have one. Thank you to the administration for meeting with the bus company to express the concerns that we and many parents have had. Do have a question and/or request. Maybe it was discussed already at that meeting, I don't know. But in regards to training, you discussed in the email that some of the training that they have to go through pretty intense in regards to, driving, actually on the road. What training is done, or can we find out in regard to interactions with students, with proactive and reactive? So proactive, what can they do to kind of try to prevent some of this, and then reactive, if this happens, if that happens, what do you do? Do you pull into the police station? Do you call an administrator? What do they do? I know, I don't know I think it was Kate's department did some training last year, I believe. I wonder if that's something that can be annual and for all new drivers, preferably before they get on the road, if at all possible.
We're definitely looking into that. I mean, obviously, that's how we kicked off the year last year with some training. I know, both Ms. Pacito and Dr. Cantor, took the time to do that before the year started. In light of things that have occurred, we have discussed and looking at following through with that. As we move into the second semester, some of it's timing and scheduling, but we're looking at moving into the second semester, and then the implication of doing this on a year basis, again, coming back with the CMD and see how we can fit it into the program. They're definitely, there's no pushback. They want the training, so it's just a matter of us, working with them, or even CMD. I think they need to have possibly, you've heard me say this, skin in the game, so to speak. They need to develop some of their own things for their own drivers. We're willing to help because we have local expertise, if you will, but I think they need to, and that was one of the things that came out of our meeting for next steps. So I think we got to the point where we needed to be now, but we know, we will meet again, in a timely fashion to go over some of these next steps. So.
Just to piggyback on that, with the 6% increase that they charged us, I think they do need to be proactive in safety and train their own employees.
All right, I had two pieces. The first, I don't know exactly if it has or it hasn't. I'm going to ask the question when I speak to the community members, most of the times, if not all of the times, I always try to recommend to them to contact their principal. Principal is always first. Contact your principal. In this particular case, we do have a lot of, and that's why I'm going to ask the question, as in it seems that a lot of parents at the middle school seem to feel that the dress code has changed. Has the dress code changed in the middle school?
The dress code has not changed. The kids' clothing has changed. So, I don't know, so it's always, I think most of us are old enough, and there's always, there's a move and there's a counter move. So even as a parent, you put a rule down in your house, and you're going to stick to it, and then somehow, some way, they figure out how to get around the rules. So now you got to figure it out again. So we have, I think there's probably a law term for that. I'm not sure, but with that being said, I know Dr. Harney has been in contact with Mr. Boyer. He's addressing this issue on a case-by-case basis with the students up there. It has to do with rips and tears.
Right, the
So
jeans.
the rips and tears now have they've gone from the ankle to the thigh. So I know he's working this out where we're looking at rips and tears now below the knee, and I think he's ready. I know he's worked with Dr. Harney, even mid-thigh. Okay. So anyhow, it's not appropriate. It's not appropriate for school. So therefore, Mr. Boyer and Mr. Becker have worked on revising those guidelines, and he's worked with parents individually on that, and he will be getting a correspondence out within the next probably 6, 7, 8 by tomorrow morning, because he wanted to do it thoughtfully. And I appreciate him taking his time to make sure that he did that. So that's the status.
That's just as long as we can contact the rest of the community, so they know the full guidelines, and they'll send their kids this thing. The second piece, though, is more of a thank you. I want to thank everyone in our community, our teachers, our community members. I want to individually thank Mr. Lindgren and his family, Kim and Mrs. Grimm and her family, they all's out there. The Pink Out night was such a success that between the Booster Club, the volleyball team, and the football club, again, we're going to raise approximately $2,000 to give to our local charity in the Phoenixville Cancer Center. So I want to really say thank you to all those that were involved in either purchasing shirts, volunteering, helping us get the donations, helping us do whatever we can. And I do want to always repeat that the funds that we're giving back to the Phoenixville Cancer Center all stays local. It's all for the families here in our own area. A family member that can't make it, they pay for a person to get driven to them, a meal that can't be done. They pay for that specific type of medicine maybe, but it all stays local. And I know 2,000 isn't a lot, but it's a lot to the school, to the community. It's a lot to Phoenixville. It's a lot to those individuals. So I want to say thank you very much, and thank you very much for helping.
Thank you.
Any other new business? Okay, I have to get back to my meeting. All right, so moving on to public comment for non-agenda items. Does anyone have public comment at this time on anything that came up tonight, non-agenda? Okay, so with that, we will adjourn the meeting. Thanks, everyone, for coming.